She joked. "The boss couldn't handle a girl like me." He heard, smiled, and said, "Try me tonight." Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She knew the barista's name, his coffee preferences, and exactly how he'd greet her every morning at 7:23 a.m. What she didn't know was that today, everything would change. Alyssa Sutherland pushed through the glass doors of Brew and Bean, her favorite cafe on the corner of Michigan Avenue. The familiar scent of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around her like a warm embrace. At 26, she moved with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where she belonged in the world, even when that world seemed determined to test her every single day. "Good morning, Alyssa," called out Danny, the young barista, with the infectious smile and paint-stained apron. "The usual? You know it." She flashed him a genuine smile, the kind that made her dark brown eyes sparkle with warmth. Her natural curls were pulled back in a sleek, low bun today, professional yet stylish, framing her face perfectly. The deep burgundy blazer she wore complemented her rich skin tone beautifully, and she carried herself with the poise of someone who had learned to command respect in rooms where she was often the only one who looked like her. As Danny worked his magic with the espresso machine, Alyssa found herself glancing around the cafe. This was her sanctuary, her transition space between home and the corporate battlefield that awaited her 18 floors up at Tech Nova Industries. Here, she could be just Alyssa, not the assistant who had to prove herself twice as hard, not the woman who fielded condescending comments with grace, just herself. "One oat milk latte with an extra shot and a dash of cinnamon," Danny announced, sliding the perfectly crafted cup across the marble counter. "You're an artist, Danny, seriously." She took her first sip and closed her eyes briefly, savoring the moment. "How's the night school going?" "Can't complain. Still think you should teach a business class there, though. I see how you handle those corporate types who come in here acting all important." Alyssa laughed, a rich sound that filled the space around them. "Trust me, dealing with egos is not a skill I want to teach." The bell above the door chimed, and a figure in an expensive charcoal suit entered. Alyssa didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She'd recognize that measured, confident footstep anywhere. Clive Standen, CEO of Tech Nova Industries, her boss. At 38, Clive moved through the world like he owned it, which in many ways he did. Tall and imposing at 6'2", he had the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and his steel-grey eyes seemed to catalogue everything and reveal nothing. The tailored suit he wore probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, yet he wore it with the casual ease of someone born to luxury. "Good morning, Mr. Standen," Danny called out cheerfully. "Black coffee? No sugar? Please." Clive's voice was deep, controlled, with just the hint of warmth that suggested he wasn't completely made of ice. Alyssa felt the familiar flutter in her stomach, the same one she'd been ignoring for months. She kept her eyes on her coffee, pretending to check emails on her phone while hyper-aware of his presence just 3 feet away. This was their routine. For the past 4 months, they'd shared this space for exactly 7 minutes each morning. He arrived at 7:30 sharp, ordered his coffee and left at 7:37. She'd timed it, though she'd never admit it to anyone. "Miss Sutherland." His voice was closer now, and she looked up to find him standing beside her, coffee in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Standen." Professional, polite, completely normal heartbeat, or so she told herself. "I trust you're prepared for the Morrison account presentation today." "Everything's ready. The reports are on your desk, and I've confirmed with their team for the 2 o'clock meeting." She met his gaze steadily, proud of how even her voice sounded, despite the way he was looking at her, like he was trying to solve a particularly complex equation. Something flickered in his eyes, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Excellent. Your attention to detail never goes unnoticed." Was that a compliment from Clive Standen? The man who said adequate when other CEOs would say outstanding? "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, that barely there smile playing at the corner of his mouth, the same mysterious expression that had been driving her crazy for weeks. "Have a good morning, Ms. Sutherland." And just like that, he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and the peculiar feeling that something important had just happened, even though nothing really had. "Girl, that man looks at you like you're a puzzle he's dying to solve," Danny observed, wiping down the counter with unnecessary vigor. "He looks at everyone like that. It's called being a CEO." But even as she said it, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that Danny might be right. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend and co-worker, Jasmine. "Girl, did you see the email? Mandatory lunch meeting in conference room B. Something big is happening." Alyssa frowned, quickly checking her work email. Sure enough, there it was. A meeting she hadn't organized, which was unusual since she handled most of Clive's scheduling. "I've got to run, Danny. See you tomorrow?" "Wouldn't be morning without you, Alyssa." As she walked the 3 blocks to the Technova building, her mind wandered to the strange interaction at the cafe. There had been something different about Clive today. A tension in his shoulders, a lingering look that lasted a beat too long. In the 18 months she'd worked for him, she'd learned to read his moods like a weather forecast. Today felt like the calm before a storm. The elevator ride to the 18th floor gave her time to mentally prepare for whatever the day might bring. She'd learned early in her career that being a young black woman in corporate America meant being ready for anything, from microaggressions disguised as compliments to having her ideas credited to male colleagues. But she'd also learned that her voice mattered, her intelligence was an asset, and her refusal to be invisible was her superpower. As the elevator doors opened, she stepped into the sleek, modern offices of Technova Industries. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Lake Michigan, and the open concept design buzzed with the energy of a company on the rise. Her desk sat just outside Clive's corner office, a position that had initially felt like being stationed at the gates of a fortress, but had gradually become her command center. "Morning, Alyssa." Jasmine bounced over to her desk, practically vibrating with excitement. At 28, Jasmine was the head of marketing and Alyssa's closest friend at the company. With her bright smile and strategic mind, she had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of something important. "What's got you so wired? It's not even 8:30. Haven't you heard? Word is that Clive's making some kind of announcement at lunch. Big changes coming." Jasmine lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Some people think it's about the European expansion. Others think he's stepping down." "He's not stepping down." Alyssa said it with more certainty than she felt. "His calendar doesn't suggest any major announcements, unless it's something he's keeping close to the vest. You know how he is about surprises." Before Alyssa could respond, the man himself emerged from his office, looking every inch the powerful CEO in his perfectly pressed shirt and tie. "Ms. Sutherland, could I see you for a moment?" "Of course." She grabbed her tablet and followed him into his office, trying to ignore Jasmine's knowing look. Clive's office was a study in controlled elegance, clean lines, expensive art, and a view that probably cost more per square foot than most people's homes. He moved to stand behind his desk but didn't sit, a sign that this would be brief. "I need you to handle something delicate today," he began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that made boards of directors fall in line. "During the lunch meeting, I want you to observe, take notes on reactions, body language, anything that seems significant. May I ask what you're planning to announce?" For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his features, so quick she might have imagined it. "Let's just say that some changes are coming, and I need to know who I can trust when the dust settles." The weight of his words settled between them. In the 18 months she'd worked for him, he'd never asked her to essentially spy on their colleagues. Whatever was coming was bigger than office gossip suggested. "You can count on me, Mr. Standen." "I know I can. That's why—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "That's why your perspective matters to me." There it was again, that moment of something deeper, something that felt less like boss and employee and more like, what? She couldn't quite put her finger on it. "I'll take detailed notes," she assured him. "Thank you." And Alyssa, he'd never used her first name at work before. The sound of it in his voice made her pulse quicken. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that your position here is secure. You've earned your place at this company." Before she could ask what that meant, his phone rang and the moment was broken. She returned to her desk with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: whatever was about to happen at lunch was going to change everything. As she settled into her morning routine of emails and scheduling, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something significant. The comfortable routine of the past year was about to be shattered, and she had no idea if what came next would be better or worse. But one thing was certain: she'd face it head-on, just like she faced everything else in her life. Because Alyssa Sutherland didn't back down from challenges. She embraced them. What she didn't know was that in 3 hours, a single comment would change not just her job, but her entire life. The laughter started innocently enough. What nobody expected was how quickly innocent could turn dangerous. Conference Room B buzzed with the kind of energy that only came from office speculation run wild. Alyssa sat near the back, tablet ready, watching her colleagues file in with expressions ranging from curious to anxious. The room's floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. But today, all attention was focused inward. Jasmine slid into the seat beside her, practically bouncing with excitement. I swear the tension in this place is thicker than my grandmother's gravy. Did you see how nervous Peterson looked walking in? Maybe because his quarterly numbers were down 15%, Alyssa whispered back, ever the pragmatist. Or maybe because he knows something we don't. Jasmine's eyes sparkled with mischief. Come on, Liz. Don't tell me you're not even a little curious about what's got everyone so worked up. Before Alyssa could respond, Clive entered the room. The conversations died instantly, replaced by the kind of respectful silence that powerful men commanded without trying. He looked every inch the billionaire CEO today. The charcoal suit from this morning had been replaced by navy blue that somehow made his grey eyes appear even more intense. His presence filled the room like electricity before a storm. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for gathering on short notice. His voice carried easily across the space, confident and controlled. I wanted to discuss some upcoming changes to our European expansion strategy. Alyssa dutifully took notes, but found herself studying faces instead of focusing on Clive's words about market penetration and quarterly projections. She noticed how Henderson from legal kept glancing at his phone, how the marketing team exchanged meaningful looks, how Peterson's jaw tightened every time budget cuts were mentioned. The restructuring will begin next quarter, Clive continued, which means some of you will be taking on additional responsibilities. I'll be meeting with department heads individually this week to discuss specifics. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room. Restructuring, additional responsibilities. Corporate speak for some people would be working harder while others might be working somewhere else entirely. Are there any questions? Clive's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Alyssa before moving on. Peterson, the VP of Operations, and a man who seemed to believe his 20 years at the company gave him the right to question everything, raised his hand. Clive, what about staff and new adjustments? Are we looking at layoffs? We're evaluating all options to maximize efficiency, Clive replied smoothly. But I want to be clear. Performance and contribution to the company will be the only factors in any decisions. The room fell quiet again, the weight of uncertainty settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. It was Melissa from HR who broke the silence, her voice pitched higher than usual with nervous energy. Well, at least we know who's safe, she said with a forced laugh, gesturing vaguely toward the front of the room. I mean, you'd have to be pretty amazing to get Mr. Stanton's attention long enough to… Melissa. The warning in Jasmine's voice was clear, but Melissa was already in too deep. Oh, come on. We've all noticed how focused he's been lately. More intense than usual, if that's even possible. Melissa's eyes glittered with the kind of gossip-hungry excitement that made Alyssa's stomach turn. I bet it would take a really special woman to crack that ice-cold exterior. Someone bold enough to actually challenge him. Eric from IT chuckled, shaking his head. Good luck to whoever tries. The man's practically a robot, all business all the time. That's not true, protested Sarah from accounting, her voice thoughtful. I've seen him smile. It's rare, but it happens. There's definitely a human being under all that CEO armor. Yeah, but what kind of woman could actually reach him? Melissa pressed, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. I mean, seriously, he'd probably need someone who isn't intimidated by power, someone who could stand up to him and not back down. Alyssa felt the conversation spiraling into territory that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She'd worked hard to maintain professionalism, to be seen as competent rather than gossip-worthy. The last thing she needed was to be part of office speculation about their boss's personal life. Maybe he's just not interested in office romance, she said diplomatically, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. Some people prefer to keep their personal and professional lives separate. But that's exactly my point, Melissa exclaimed, turning to face Alyssa directly. It would take someone really confident to break through those walls, someone who wouldn't be afraid to call him out when he's being too intense. Jasmine shot Alyssa a look that clearly said abort mission, but it was too late. The conversation had taken on a life of its own. I don't know, Eric mused, leaning back in his chair. I think our fearless leader is probably too set in his ways. He'd need someone who could match his energy, someone who wouldn't let him get away with that whole mysterious billionaire act. Exactly, Melissa clapped her hands together. Someone like... Her eyes landed on Alyssa with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. Someone like you, Alyssa. You're the only one who doesn't seem fazed by him. The room's attention shifted to Alyssa like a spotlight she definitely didn't want. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. I think you're giving me too much credit. No, seriously, Melissa continued, apparently oblivious to Alyssa's discomfort. You're confident, you're smart, you speak your mind. I bet you could handle someone like him. In fact, she paused dramatically, and Alyssa felt disaster approaching like a freight train. I bet you're exactly the type of woman who could break through Mr. Standon's defenses. Melissa, really? Alyssa started. Come on, admit it, Melissa pressed, her voice rising with excitement. You've thought about it, haven't you? What it would be like to see the real him behind all that corporate perfection. Jasmine was making frantic, cut-it-out gestures, but the damage was building momentum. Other colleagues were starting to chime in, the conversation taking on the giddy energy of shared mischief. I actually think Melissa's right, Sarah added. Alyssa's got that perfect combination of professional and fearless. She'd probably be the first person to tell him when he's being unreasonable. And she's gorgeous, added Eric matter-of-factly. If anyone could catch his attention... Stop! Alyssa's voice was firm but quiet. This is completely inappropriate. We're talking about our boss. But that's what makes it interesting, Melissa laughed. I mean, imagine the look on his face if someone actually had the nerve to challenge him, really challenge him. The conversation was spiraling completely out of control now, and Alyssa felt trapped between defending her professionalism and not wanting to appear prudish. She glanced toward the door, calculating whether she could make a graceful exit. That's when Jasmine, in what would later be remembered as either an act of salvation or sabotage, decided to join the fray. You know what? Jasmine said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made a decision. I think Melissa's absolutely right. And honestly, Alyssa, you probably are the only woman in this building who wouldn't be intimidated by him. No, hear me out, Jasmine continued, warming to the theme. You've got that thing where you say exactly what you think, regardless of who's listening. It's actually pretty impressive. Thank you, but I bet, Melissa interrupted, her eyes bright with mischief, that Mr. Standon wouldn't know what to do with a woman like you, someone who actually pushes back. The room had taken on the energy of a middle school dare, and Alyssa could feel the situation slipping beyond her control. She needed to shut this down before it went any further. Look, I appreciate the confidence, she said, forcing a laugh, but I think you're all seriously overestimating my effect on people. Trust me, Mr. Standon sees me as exactly what I am, his assistant. Nothing more, nothing less. But what if he didn't? The question came from Sarah, asked with genuine curiosity rather than malicious intent. What if he saw you as... more? He doesn't, Alyssa said firmly. And that's fine. I'm here to do my job, not to be anyone's romantic interest. But if he did, Melissa pressed, you'd totally be able to handle him, right? I mean, you wouldn't back down. And there it was, the trap she'd been trying to avoid. Say yes, and she'd be confirming their speculation. Say no, and she'd sound like she was intimidated by him, which would only fuel more gossip. Alyssa looked around the room at her colleagues' expectant faces, feeling cornered and increasingly frustrated. These were professional adults, and they were acting like teenagers playing truth or dare. Fine, she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the giggles. If Mr. Standon was interested in that kind of relationship, which he's not, then yes, I suppose I could handle myself. I don't intimidate easily. See, Melissa practically crowed. I knew it. You've got that confidence he'd probably find completely irresistible. That's not what I said, but it's what you meant, Jasmine added with a grin. Come on, Liz, admit it. You're probably the only person in this building who could go toe-to-toe with him and not blink. Alyssa felt her patience finally reach its limit. The conversation had moved so far beyond appropriate that she couldn't even see the line anymore. She was about to say something definitive to end this ridiculous speculation when the words tumbled out of her mouth, almost without her permission. Fine. You want to know the truth? He wouldn't be able to handle a woman like me. The room went dead silent, and that's when she heard it. The soft sound of polished leather shoes on marble floor. The kind of measured, confident footstep she'd recognize anywhere. Alyssa's blood turned to ice as she slowly turned toward the door. Clive Standon stood in the doorway, his steel-grey eyes fixed directly on her, wearing an expression she'd never seen before. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't amusement either. It was something far more dangerous. And in that moment, as their eyes met across a room full of stunned colleagues, Alyssa realized she'd just issued a challenge to the most powerful man she'd ever known. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then he smiled, and somehow that was infinitely more terrifying than anger would have been. The conference room had never felt smaller. 23 people sat frozen in their chairs, watching the standoff between their CEO and his assistant, like spectators at a tennis match where the stakes were someone's career. Alyssa could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the weight of every stare, but she couldn't look away from Clive's face. He stepped into the room with that predatory grace that made boardrooms fall silent and competitors nervous. His steel-grey eyes never left hers as he moved, and that almost smile playing at the corner of his mouth was both mesmerizing and absolutely terrifying. "Please don't let me interrupt," he said, his voice carrying that deceptively calm tone that every employee had learned to recognize as dangerous. "It sounds like you were having quite the fascinating discussion." Melissa, who had been the ringleader of the conversation just moments before, now looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. The color had drained from her face, and she was staring at her hands like they held the secrets of the universe. "Mr. Standen," Jasmine started, her voice unnaturally high, "we were just speculating about my personal life." He raised an eyebrow, finally breaking eye contact with Alyssa to glance around the room. "Please continue. I'm particularly interested in hearing more about this theory regarding what type of woman I can or cannot handle." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alyssa watched her colleagues transform into statues, each one apparently hoping that if they stayed perfectly still, they might become invisible. "That's what I thought." Clive's attention returned to Alyssa, and she felt pinned like a butterfly in a display case. "Ms. Sutherland, since you seem to have such strong opinions on the subject, perhaps you'd care to elaborate." Every instinct told her to apologize, to backtrack, to find some way to minimize what she'd said. She could feel the collective will of her colleagues urging her to take the safe route, to diffuse the situation with humor or humility. Instead, she found herself straightening in her chair. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Standen." Her voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away of the chaos happening inside her chest. "The conversation was hypothetical." "Hypothetical." He repeated the word like he was tasting wine, considering its flavor. "I see. So when you said I wouldn't be able to handle a woman like you, that was purely theoretical." The way he said it, "a woman like you," made something flutter low in her stomach. There was a challenge in his voice, but underneath it was something else, something that sounded almost like interest. "That's correct." He took another step closer, and she caught the faint scent of his cologne, something expensive and subtly masculine that made her think of boardrooms and power and dangerous decisions made in the dark. "And what exactly makes you so unhandleable?" The word rolled off his tongue with deliberate precision, and Alyssa felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite her best efforts to remain composed. She was acutely aware that everyone in the room was hanging on every word, that this conversation would be dissected and analyzed over coffee machines and in bathroom whispers for weeks to come. But looking into Clive's eyes, she found she didn't care. "I speak my mind," she said simply. "I don't apologize for having opinions, and I don't back down when I believe I'm right, even when you're talking to your boss. Especially then." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or approval. It was gone too quickly for her to be sure, but she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Interesting theory," he murmured, then raised his voice to address the room. "I think this meeting has run its course. Everyone can return to work." The exodus was immediate and grateful. Chairs scraped against the floor as her colleagues practically fled the room, shooting her looks that ranged from sympathetic to impressed to mildly terrified. Jasmine squeezed her shoulder as she passed, whispering, "Text me later," before disappearing with the rest of them. Within 30 seconds, the conference room was empty except for Alyssa and Clive. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of moments before. This was charged electric, full of unspoken questions and dangerous possibilities. Alyssa remained seated, partly because her legs felt unreliable, and partly because she refused to show any sign of retreat. Clive walked slowly around the conference table, his movements deliberate and measured. When he reached her side, he pulled out the chair next to hers and sat down, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes. "That was either very brave or very stupid," he said quietly. "I haven't decided which yet." He laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was rich and warm and completely unexpected. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Probably ended my career. She tried to keep her tone light, but there was real concern underneath the joke. Not even close. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You've just done something no one has managed to do in years. Which is? Surprised me. They looked at each other across the small space between their chairs, and Alyssa felt the air grow thick with possibility. This was her boss. Her incredibly powerful, impossibly attractive, completely off-limits boss. And she was sitting in an empty conference room with him, having a conversation that felt more like foreplay than a professional discussion. Mr. Standen, Clive. The correction was soft but firm. I think we're past formalities, don't you? The use of his first name felt intimate in a way that made her pulse quicken. Clive, she repeated, testing the word on her tongue. It fit better than she'd expected. You said I wouldn't be able to handle a woman like you, he continued, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. Were you speaking from experience, or was that wishful thinking? The question hit her like a physical blow. Direct, provocative, and loaded with implications that made her mind race. She could deflect, could laugh it off, could pretend she didn't understand what he was really asking. Instead, she met his gaze steadily and decided to match his boldness. I guess that would depend on whether you're interested in finding out. The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Clive's eyes darkened, and for a moment Alyssa thought he might lean closer, might cross the final inches that separated them. Instead, he stood up slowly, smoothing down his tie with hands that were perfectly steady. Ms. Sutherland, he said, his voice formal again but carrying an undertone that made her name sound like a caress. I believe you have some reports to prepare for the Morrison account. The shift back to professionalism was so abrupt, it left her dizzy. Yes, sir? Good. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Oh, and Alyssa. She looked up at him, trying to read the expression on his face. My office, 8 o'clock tonight. I believe we have some things to discuss. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone in the conference room with the scent of his cologne and the echo of her own heartbeat. Alyssa sat perfectly still for a full minute, processing what had just happened. She'd challenged the most powerful man she knew, flirted with professional suicide, and somehow emerged with what felt suspiciously like a date. Well, not a date, exactly, but definitely something. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine. Girl, what just happened? Alyssa typed back, I think I'm about to find out. As she gathered her things and prepared to return to her desk, she caught sight of her reflection in the conference room's glass wall. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with something that looked dangerously like excitement. She looked like a woman who'd just issued a challenge to fate itself, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't wait to see what fate would do in return. 8 o'clock couldn't come fast enough, or perhaps it was coming far too quickly. She stood outside his office at 7:58 p.m., heart racing, wondering if she was about to make the best decision of her life, or the worst. The Technova building at night was a different beast entirely. Gone were the bustling conversations and clicking keyboards, replaced by the soft hum of cleaning crews and the distant rumble of Chicago traffic 18 floors below. The executive level was eerily quiet, lit only by the scattered glow of desk lamps and the city lights streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Alyssa had gone home after work, ostensibly to change clothes, but really to give herself time to think. She'd stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the impossible task of choosing an outfit for a meeting that wasn't quite professional, but definitely wasn't personal either. In the end, she'd settled on a deep emerald blouse that brought out the warmth in her dark skin, and black slacks that struck the right balance between authoritative and feminine. Now, standing in the hallway outside Clive's office, she could see him through the glass walls. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing strong forearms as he leaned over some documents. The image was unexpectedly intimate. This was Clive Standen without his armor, without the formal distance that usually surrounded him like a force field. She knocked softly on the doorframe. Come in. His voice carried that same controlled warmth she'd heard in the conference room, and when he looked up, his grey eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance in a single sweep. You came, he said, setting down his pen and giving her his full attention. You sounded like it wasn't really optional. She stepped into his office, acutely aware of how different the space felt without the usual bustle of business hours. More intimate, more dangerous. It wasn't. He gestured to the sitting area near the windows. 2 leather chairs and a small table that overlooked the glittering expanse of downtown Chicago. "Please sit." She settled into one of the chairs, noting how he chose to sit in the other rather than maintaining the power dynamic of staying behind his desk. The move felt significant, like a small gesture toward equality that she appreciated more than she cared to admit. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, water?" His manners were impeccable, but there was an underlying tension in his voice that suggested he was as affected by this unusual situation as she was. "I'm fine, thank you." For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The city spread out below them like a carpet of stars, but Alyssa found herself much more interested in studying the man across from her. With his tie loosened and his guard down, Clive looked younger somehow, more human. The harsh lines of corporate authority had softened into something that was infinitely more appealing. "You're wondering why I asked you here," he said finally. "The thought had crossed my mind. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure myself." He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that seemed unconsciously vulnerable. "That conversation today, it's been a long time since anyone surprised me like that. Is that what this is? Professional curiosity?" "No." The answer was immediate and definitive. "No, it's not." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Alyssa felt her pulse quicken, but forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "Then what is it?" Clive was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the city lights beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've spent the last 15 years building this company. 15 years focused on nothing but growth, profit, expansion. I convinced myself that was enough, that success was enough." He turned to look at her, and she was startled by the raw honesty in his expression. "And then you walked into that conference room today and said something that made me realize how empty that feels." "What did I say?" "You called me out. You looked me in the eye and told me I couldn't handle you, and you meant it." A slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Do you have any idea how refreshing that is?" Alyssa felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was defending myself. My colleagues were making assumptions. They were right, though, weren't they? About you being different." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You don't defer to me because of my title. You don't agree with me because it's expected. You challenge me. Is that what you want? To be challenged? I didn't think so. Until today." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Alyssa, I want to be completely honest with you. What I'm feeling right now, and it's not appropriate. You work for me. There's a power dynamic here that makes this complicated." Her heart was racing now, but she kept her voice steady. "Are you asking me to pretend this conversation never happened?" "I'm asking you what you want." The question was simple, but the weight behind it was enormous. She could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Say the wrong thing, and they'd go back to being boss and employee, pretending this electric connection between them didn't exist. Say the right thing, and everything would change. "I want honesty," she said finally. "I want to know what this is, what it could be. I want to stop pretending I don't notice the way you look at me sometimes, or that I don't feel something when you're in the same room." Something shifted in his expression, relief maybe, or recognition. "And the complications, your job, the gossip, the fact that I'm your boss, those are real concerns," she admitted. "But I've never been the type to let fear make my decisions for me." Clive stood up slowly, moving to the window. The city lights cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. "I have a confession to make. I'm listening. I've been going to that coffee shop every morning for 4 months, not because I particularly like their coffee, but because I knew you'd be there." He turned to face her, and she saw vulnerability in his expression that took her breath away. "I've been looking forward to those 7 minutes every day, more than I've looked forward to anything in years." The admission hit her like a physical blow. All those mornings, all those careful exchanges, he'd been as aware of her as she was of him. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I'm your boss. Because it would have been inappropriate. Because I convinced myself it was just attraction, and it would fade." He moved closer, stopping just in front of her chair. "But it didn't fade, Alyssa. If anything, it's gotten stronger." She looked up at him, this powerful man who was confessing to months of secret attraction, and felt something settle into place in her chest. This wasn't just physical attraction, or the thrill of the forbidden. This was something deeper, something that had been building between them in stolen glances and carefully professional conversations. "So what happens now?" she asked softly. "Now we decide if we're brave enough to see where this leads." He extended his hand to her, and she could see the question in his eyes. "But I need you to know, if we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back. Everything changes." She looked at his outstretched hand, thinking about all the reasons this was complicated, all the ways it could go wrong. Then she thought about the way he'd defended her earlier, the way he looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room, the way he'd admitted to orchestrating their morning encounters just to see her. She placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, she felt electricity shoot up her arm. His fingers were warm and strong, and when he helped her to her feet, she found herself standing close enough to see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, she stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I told you I don't back down when I believe I'm right. And what do you believe about this?" She reached up, her fingers barely grazing the line of his jaw. "I believe you were wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "You can handle me just fine." Her voice was soft, but sure. "The question is whether you want to." For a moment they stood frozen, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Then Clive's hand came up to cover hers against his face, and his eyes closed briefly, as if he was memorizing the touch. When he opened them again, they were dark with something that made her breath catch. "I've wanted to since the first day you walked into my office," he murmured. And then, finally, inevitably, he kissed her. The city lights blurred beyond the windows, as two people who had been circling each other for months finally stopped running. The kiss changed everything. What they didn't expect was how naturally everything would fall into place afterward. Alyssa had kissed enough men in her 26 years to know the difference between good and great. What happened in Clive's office that night transcended both categories entirely. It wasn't just the way his lips moved against hers, or how his hands framed her face like she was something precious, or even the way he kissed her like he'd been thinking about it for months, which, apparently, he had. It was the way the world seemed to shift on its axis, rearranging itself around this new reality, where Clive Standen kissed her like she was oxygen, and he'd been holding his breath for years. When they finally broke apart, foreheads touching, breathing unsteady, the silence that followed was different from any they'd shared before. It was charged with possibility, and weighted with the knowledge that there was no going back. That was... Clive's voice was rougher than usual, his hands still cradling her face. "Yeah," she whispered, not trusting herself to form complete sentences. They stayed like that for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Finally, Clive stepped back slightly, though his hands remained on her shoulders as if he couldn't quite bring himself to break contact completely. "We should probably talk about what this means," he said, ever the practical businessman even in the aftermath of earth-moving kisses. "Probably," she smiled up at him, feeling giddy and terrified, and more alive than she had in months. "But not tonight." "No? Tonight I just want to process the fact that you've been orchestrating coffee shop encounters like some kind of CEO stalker." The teasing was gentle, but it served its purpose of lightening the intense atmosphere. He laughed, and the sound was warm and unguarded. "When you put it like that, it sounds significantly less romantic." Oh, it was romantic. Misguided and potentially creepy, but romantic. She reached up to straighten his tie, a gesture that felt both intimate and oddly domestic. "I've been timing my arrivals to make sure I'd see you too." "Really? Really? 7:23 every single day?" She grinned at his surprised expression. "Turns out we're both terrible at the whole professional distance thing." The admission seemed to ease something in him. His shoulders relaxed, and when he smiled, it was the first completely unguarded expression she'd ever seen from him. "So what happens tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow we figure out how to be normal human beings who work together and are whatever this is." She gestured between them, encompassing the invisible thread that seemed to connect them. "Tonight you walk me to my car like a gentleman, and I go home and try to convince myself this actually happened. This definitely happened." His voice was soft, certain. "And tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." The elevator ride down to the parking garage was quiet but comfortable. Clive stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but he kept his hands to himself. The restraint felt significant, a recognition that they were entering uncharted territory that required careful navigation. "Which car is yours?" he asked as they stepped into the dimly lit garage. "The blue Honda." She pointed toward a modest sedan that looked almost apologetic next to the luxury vehicles that filled the executive parking spaces. As they walked toward her car, Alyssa found herself hyper-aware of everything, the sound of their footsteps echoing off concrete walls, the way their shadows moved together under the fluorescent lights, the careful distance Clive maintained that somehow felt more intimate than touching. "Thank you," she said when they reached her car, turning to face him. "For what?" "For being honest. For taking the risk. For—" She paused, searching for the right words. "For seeing me." Something soft and vulnerable flickered across his features. "Alyssa, I've been seeing you since the first day you walked into my office wearing that yellow dress and told me my filing system was aggressively inefficient." The memory made her laugh. "I can't believe you remember that." "I remember everything about that day. You reorganized my entire office in 3 hours and somehow made it look like you'd been doing it for years. I knew then that you were going to be trouble. The good kind of trouble? The best kind." He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers in a touch that was barely there, but sent electricity shooting up her arm. "Drive safe." "I will." She unlocked her car, but didn't immediately get in, reluctant to end this perfect, surreal evening. "Clive? Yeah? Tomorrow morning at the coffee shop. Do we pretend this didn't happen?" He considered the question seriously, and she loved that about him. The way he thought before he spoke, the way he treated her questions like they mattered. "I don't think I could pretend if I tried," he said finally. "But we'll keep it professional, at least until we figure out what we're doing. Deal?" She was halfway into her car when his voice stopped her. "Alyssa." She turned back to look at him, this powerful man standing alone in a parking garage looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "I'm glad you came tonight." "Me too." The drive home passed in a blur of city lights and scattered thoughts. Alyssa found herself replaying every moment of the evening. The way Clive had looked at her when she'd walked into his office, the raw honesty in his voice when he'd confessed to months of coffee shop encounters, the way he'd kissed her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. Her apartment felt different when she walked through the door. The same furniture, the same carefully chosen artwork, the same plants that she managed to keep alive through sheer determination, but somehow everything looked different through the lens of what had just happened. She changed into comfortable pajamas and made herself a cup of tea, settling onto her couch with her phone. 3 missed calls from Jasmine, along with a series of increasingly frantic text messages. "Girl, where are you? Did he fire you? Are you okay? I'm about to call the police." "Answer your phone." Alyssa smiled as she typed back, "I'm fine, long story, we'll call you tomorrow." The response was immediate. That better be one hell of a story. It was. It absolutely was. As she got ready for bed, Alyssa caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. Her lipstick was gone, her hair slightly mussed, and there was something different in her eyes, a sparkle that hadn't been there that morning. She looked like a woman who'd just had her world tilted off its axis in the best possible way. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sleep well. C." She saved the contact with fingers that trembled slightly, then typed back, "You too." As she settled into bed, Alyssa realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't mentally rehearsing tomorrow's schedule or worrying about upcoming deadlines. Instead, she was thinking about grey eyes and gentle hands, and the way Clive had said her name like it was something precious. Tomorrow would bring complications. There would be office politics to navigate, professional boundaries to establish, and probably a very intense conversation with Jasmine. There would be questions about what they were doing and whether it was worth the risk. But tonight, she was just a woman who'd been kissed by a man who'd been thinking about her for months. Tonight, that was enough. Outside her window, Chicago hummed with its usual nighttime energy, but inside her apartment, everything was quiet and still and full of possibility. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. 7:23 a.m. would never be the same again. She'd rehearsed 17 different ways to act normal. None of them prepared her for the way he looked at her when she walked into the coffee shop. Alyssa woke up at 6:15 a.m., 30 minutes before her alarm was set to go off. She'd tossed and turned most of the night, her mind replaying every moment of the previous evening in vivid detail. The kiss, the conversation, the way Clive had looked at her like she was something miraculous. It all felt like a dream that was too good to be true. But the text message on her phone proved it had been very, very real. She spent an extra 20 minutes getting ready, changing outfits 3 times, before settling on a deep purple blouse that brought out the warmth in her dark skin and made her feel confident. Not that she was trying to impress anyone. This was just another Tuesday morning at Technova Industries, where she definitely hadn't kissed her boss less than 12 hours ago. The walk to Brew and Bean felt different today. Every step brought her closer to seeing Clive again, and she wasn't sure if the butterflies in her stomach were excitement or terror, maybe both. The coffee shop was busier than usual, filled with the morning rush of professionals grabbing their caffeine fix before facing another day in corporate America. Alyssa scanned the familiar space, half expecting to see Clive already there, but he was nowhere to be found. "Morning, Alyssa," Danny called out from behind the counter, his usual cheerful demeanor brightened by an extra dose of curiosity. "You're glowing today. Something good happen?" "Just a good night's sleep," she lied smoothly, moving to her usual spot in line. "Uh-huh." Danny's grin suggested he wasn't buying it for a second. "Well, whatever it was, keep doing it. You look radiant." As Danny worked on her latte, Alyssa found herself checking the door every few seconds. It was 7:28 a.m. Clive should have been here by now. Had last night changed their routine? Was he avoiding the coffee shop to avoid awkwardness? Or was he simply running late? "One oat milk latte with an extra shot and a dash of cinnamon," Danny announced, sliding her cup across the counter. "Thanks, Danny." She was reaching for her wallet when the bell above the door chimed. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her body seemed to recognize his presence before her mind did, a subtle shift in the air that made her hyper-aware of everything around her. "Good morning." His voice was the same rich baritone she'd heard yesterday, but there was something different in the way he said it, warmer, more intimate. Like they shared a secret that no one else in the coffee shop could possibly understand. She turned to face him, and the breath caught in her throat. He looked impeccable as always, charcoal suit perfectly tailored, tie knotted with precision, not a hair out of place. But his eyes were softer than she'd ever seen them, and when they met hers, she saw something that made her pulse quicken. "Good morning, Mr. Standen." The formal address felt strange on her tongue now, but they were in public, surrounded by other customers who had no idea that their world had shifted on its axis the night before. "The usual, Mr. Standen?" Danny asked, already reaching for a cup. "Please." Clive moved to stand beside Alyssa, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same scent that had surrounded her when he'd kissed her. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" It was actually overcast and threatening rain, but Alyssa found herself nodding. "Very beautiful." They stood in comfortable silence as Danny prepared Clive's coffee, both of them pretending to check their phones while stealing glances at each other. The air between them hummed with unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened, of what had changed. "Black coffee, no sugar," Danny announced, and Clive stepped forward to pay. "Thank you." He took the cup and turned back to Alyssa. "Shall we walk to the office together?" It was a simple question, but it felt loaded with significance. In the 18 months she'd worked for him, they'd never walked to work together. They'd shared elevator rides, certainly, but those had been brief professional encounters. This felt different. This felt like a choice. That would be nice. The 3-block walk to Technova Industries had never felt so short or so long simultaneously. They maintained a careful professional distance, but Alyssa was acutely aware of every step, every breath, every subtle shift in Clive's posture as they navigated the morning sidewalk traffic. "Did you sleep well?" he asked as they waited for a traffic light to change. Eventually, she glanced up at him, noting the slight shadows under his eyes that suggested his night had been as restless as hers. "You?" "Not particularly." The admission was quiet, honest, and somehow made her feel better about her own sleepless night. "Any regrets?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately wished she could take it back. Too direct, too vulnerable, too soon. Clive stopped walking, causing her to halt beside him in the middle of the busy sidewalk. People flowed around them like water around stones as he turned to face her fully. "Not a single one," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You?" "No." The word came out as barely a whisper, but it carried all the certainty she felt. No regrets. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. For a moment, standing there surrounded by rushing commuters and city noise, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "Good," he said simply, and they resumed walking. The Technova building loomed ahead of them, all glass and steel and corporate efficiency. As they approached the entrance, Alyssa felt the weight of reality settling back into place. Inside those walls, he was the CEO, and she was his assistant. Inside those walls, they had roles to play and professional boundaries to maintain. "After you," Clive said, holding the door open for her. The lobby was busy with the morning arrival rush, colleagues greeting each other with coffee-fueled enthusiasm, and the occasional complaint about traffic or weather. Alyssa moved through the familiar space with practiced ease, hyper-aware of Clive's presence behind her, but careful not to show it. The elevator ride to the 18th floor was shared with 3 other employees, making conversation impossible. But as they stood in the small space, Alyssa caught Clive's reflection in the polished steel doors. He was watching her with an expression that was carefully neutral, but somehow managed to convey volumes. When the doors opened on their floor, she stepped out first, falling naturally into the rhythm of another workday. Her desk was exactly as she'd left it, organized and ready for whatever the day might bring. Clive's office door stood open, waiting for him to begin the series of meetings and calls that comprised his daily routine. "Miss Sutherland," he said as she settled at her desk, his voice carrying the formal tone that was expected in their professional environment. "Could you bring me the Morrison files when you have a moment?" "Of course, Mr. Standen." But as she stood to retrieve the files, he added quietly, "And thank you for the coffee shop recommendation. I think I'll be visiting there more regularly." The comment was innocuous enough that anyone overhearing would think nothing of it, but the way he said it, with just the hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth, made her pulse quicken. "I'm glad you're enjoying it," she replied, matching his professional tone while fighting back a smile of her own. As she gathered the Morrison files, Alyssa caught sight of Jasmine approaching her desk with the determined stride of someone who had questions and intended to get answers. "Girl," Jasmine said without preamble, "you look different today. Good different. Like really good different. What happened after you left yesterday?" "Nothing dramatic," Alyssa said carefully, aware that Clive was within earshot in his office. "Just a productive meeting." "Uh-huh." Jasmine's expression suggested she wasn't buying the casual explanation. "And this productive meeting is why you're practically glowing this morning." "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Liar." But Jasmine's tone was affectionate rather than accusatory. "Fine, keep your secrets, but we're having lunch today and you're going to tell me everything." Before Alyssa could respond, her phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender made her breath catch. C. Standen. "The Morrison meeting has been moved to 3 p.m. Please adjust my calendar accordingly. Also, I was wondering if you'd be interested in discussing the Henderson account over dinner tonight. I have some ideas I'd like to run by you." C. Alyssa read the message twice, her heart racing. To anyone else, it would look like a perfectly normal work email, but she could read between the lines, could see the invitation hidden in professional language. She typed back quickly, "Calendar, updated. I'd be happy to discuss the Henderson account this evening. What time and where?" His response came within minutes. 7 o'clock. "I'll send you the address." And Alyssa, "Thank you for being willing to put in the extra time." The use of her first name in a work email should have felt inappropriate. Instead, it felt like a secret, a small rebellion against the professional distance they were supposed to maintain. "Earth to Alyssa," Jasmine said, waving a hand in front of her face. "You're smiling at your computer screen. That's either very good news or you've finally snapped from corporate stress." "Just pleased about a client meeting," Alyssa said, quickly closing her email. "Nothing exciting." "Right." Jasmine's expression was skeptical but amused. "Well, when you're ready to tell me about this nothing exciting, you know where to find me." As Jasmine walked away, Alyssa leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a small smile. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been Clive Standen's efficient professional assistant. Now she was a woman with dinner plans and a secret that made her feel like she was floating 6 inches off the ground. From his office came the sound of Clive's voice as he began his first conference call of the day. Professional, authoritative, completely in control. But Alyssa knew now what lay beneath that controlled exterior. Warmth, vulnerability, and the kind of passion that could change everything. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one with an address and a single word. Tonight. She had 8 hours to figure out how to survive a dinner that wasn't quite a date, but definitely wasn't just business. The restaurant was intimate enough to be romantic, professional enough to be appropriate. What neither of them expected was how impossible it would be to maintain the pretense. Stella's was the kind of restaurant that Chicago food critics wrote about in hushed, reverent tones, understated elegance wrapped in exposed brick and soft lighting, where conversations were conducted in murmurs and every table felt like a private world. As Alyssa stepped through the heavy wooden door at exactly 7 o'clock, she understood immediately why Clive had chosen this place. It was perfect for a business dinner that wasn't really a business dinner at all. The hostess, an elegant woman with silver hair and knowing eyes, smiled warmly as Alyssa approached. "You must be Ms. Sutherland. Mr. Standen is already seated. Right this way, please." The restaurant was busier than she'd expected for a Tuesday evening. filled with couples celebrating anniversaries and business associates closing deals over plates of food that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. She followed the hostess through the maze of tables, her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor, and then she saw him. Clive sat at a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the city lights beginning to twinkle beyond the windows. He changed out of his work clothes into a navy blue button-down that made his eyes look almost silver in the restaurant's warm lighting. When he saw her approaching, he stood immediately, a gesture of courtesy that felt both familiar and thrillingly new. Alyssa. Her name on his lips sounded different here, away from the corporate formality of Technova. Warmer, more intimate. You look beautiful. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a deep burgundy dress that was professional enough for a work dinner, but feminine enough to remind them both that this was something more. The way Clive was looking at her suggested the message had been received loud and clear. Thank you. She accepted the chair he pulled out for her, hyper-aware of his proximity as he helped her settle at the table. This place is gorgeous. I thought you might like it. He returned to his seat across from her, and she noticed he'd positioned himself so they could speak quietly without being overheard. I wasn't sure what kind of cuisine you preferred. I'm adventurous when it comes to food. She picked up the menu, scanning the elegant descriptions of dishes she could barely pronounce. What do you recommend? Everything I've had here has been exceptional, but I have to admit I'm more interested in the company than the food tonight. The comment was delivered casually, but it made her pulse quicken. They were supposed to be discussing the Henderson account, maintaining the pretense that this was a business meeting. Instead, Clive was looking at her like she was the most fascinating person in the room. We should probably order, she said, though what she really meant was, we should probably remember why we're supposed to be here. Of course. But his smile suggested he understood exactly what she was really saying. Their server appeared as if summoned, a young man with the kind of professional warmth that suggested excellent training and even better tips. Clive ordered wine with the casual confidence of someone who knew his way around an expensive bottle, while Alyssa chose the salmon and tried not to think about how this felt exactly like a date. So, she said once they were alone again, the Henderson account. Right, Henderson. Clive leaned back in his chair, and she caught a glimpse of something playful in his expression. They're an important client. Very important, she agreed solemnly. We should definitely discuss strategies. Absolutely. Strategies are crucial. He was fighting back a smile now, and she realized they were both participating in the worst business conversation in corporate history. Mr. Standen, she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, are we actually going to talk about work tonight? Do you want to talk about work? Not particularly. Good, he said, his smile breaking free completely. Because I have absolutely no interest in discussing Henderson's quarterly projections when I could be learning about the woman who reorganized my entire filing system and somehow made it better. The wine arrived, providing a convenient pause in their conversation, while the server went through the ritual of tasting and approval. Alyssa used the time to study Clive's face in the warm restaurant lighting, noting the way his features had relaxed since leaving the office. This was a different version of him, still polished and sophisticated, but more human somehow, more approachable. Tell me something I don't know about you, he said, once they were alone again, raising his glass in a subtle toast. That's a dangerous question. I like danger. She sipped her wine, considering. I wanted to be a chef when I was little. I used to watch cooking shows and practice making elaborate meals for my family. What changed your mind? Reality. Cooking professionally is brutal. Long hours, intense pressure, terrible pay. I decided I'd rather keep it as something I love instead of something that pays the bills. She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. What about you? Did you always want to be a CEO? God, no. The answer came with a laugh that was both rueful and genuine. I wanted to be a mechanic. I loved taking things apart, figuring out how they worked, putting them back together better than before. Hence the classic car restoration. He looked surprised. How did you know about that? I pay attention. She realized how that sounded and felt heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, you mentioned it once in passing, during a phone call with your insurance company. You remember that? I remember a lot of things. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. Like what? Like how you take your coffee. Like the fact that you tap your pen against your desk when you're thinking. Like how you always say thank you to the cleaning staff, even though most executives don't notice they exist. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see the truth in her words. I notice things about you, Clive. The use of his first name felt deliberate, intimate. His response was immediate and intense. His eyes darkened, and she saw his hand tighten almost imperceptibly around his wineglass. "Alyssa," he said, his voice lower than before, "do you have any idea what you do to me?" The question hung between them like a live wire. This was dangerous territory, far beyond the safe boundaries of professional interaction. But looking into his eyes, seeing the raw honesty there, she found she didn't care about danger. "Tell me," she whispered. Before he could answer, their food arrived. The server placed their plates with practiced efficiency, asking if they needed anything else before disappearing discreetly. The interruption should have broken the spell, should have reminded them both that they were in a public place, having a conversation that was becoming increasingly inappropriate. Instead, it only heightened the tension. They ate in relative silence for a few minutes, but the quiet was charged with awareness. Every accidental brush of fingers when reaching for water glasses, every shared glance, every subtle shift in posture seemed magnified. Alyssa had attended dozens of business dinners in her career, but none had ever felt so intensely intimate. "This is really good," she said, gesturing to her salmon, desperate to find some neutral ground before she did something completely unprofessional like reach across the table and touch his hand. "I'm glad you like it." But he wasn't looking at her food. He was looking at her lips, and the expression in his eyes made her forget how to breathe properly. "Clive," she started, not sure what she was going to say. "I know." His voice was rough with something that sounded like restraint. "This is complicated. Very complicated. We work together. We do. People would talk. They would. It could affect both our careers. It could." They stared at each other across the small table, both of them cataloguing all the reasons this was a terrible idea, neither of them looking like they cared about a single one of those reasons. "Alyssa," he said finally, "I need you to know that whatever this is between us, whatever we decide to do about it, your job is safe. Your position at Technova has nothing to do with this." The clarification was important, she knew. It addressed the power dynamic that made their situation so complicated. But hearing it also made her realize how far they'd already traveled from boss and employee towards something else entirely. "I know," she said softly, "and I need you to know that I'm here because I want to be, not because I feel obligated." "Good." The relief in his voice was palpable. "That's good." They finished dinner with conversation that felt increasingly natural, increasingly right. He told her about growing up in a family that expected excellence and achievement, about the pressure of taking over a company at 30 and proving himself capable of running it. She shared stories about her childhood in Chicago, about parents who worked 2 jobs each to give her opportunities they'd never had, about the pride and pressure that came with being the first in her family to work in corporate America. By the time dessert arrived, a chocolate creation that was too beautiful to eat and too delicious to resist, they were laughing together like old friends, or like something more than friends. "I should probably get going," Alyssa said reluctantly as they finished the last bites of chocolate. "Early morning tomorrow." "Of course." But neither of them made any move to signal for the check. This was, she searched for the right word, something that could encompass the evening without being too revealing. "Nice, really nice." It was. He signaled the server for the check, and she noticed he didn't even glance at the total before placing his credit card on the small tray. "Alyssa?" "Yes? I'd like to do this again. Soon." The admission was simple, honest, and completely devastating to her remaining resolve. So would I. Outside the restaurant, under the soft glow of Chicago streetlights, they faced the question of what happened next. 3 weeks of stolen moments and careful professionalism. What they didn't anticipate was how quickly whispers could turn into storms. The morning routine at Brew and Bean had evolved into something approaching art. Clive would arrive at 7:30, order his black coffee, and wait exactly 90 seconds before approaching Alyssa's table. She would look up from her phone with practiced surprise, as if she hadn't been timing his entrance down to the second. They'd exchange pleasantries about the weather or weekend plans, nothing that would seem inappropriate to casual observers, while their eyes said everything their words couldn't. It was a delicate dance they'd perfected over the past 3 weeks, ever since that dinner at Stella's had officially crossed them into territory that was decidedly not professional. They'd managed 2 more dinners since then, both disguised as work meetings, both ending with lingering conversations on street corners and the kind of restrained goodbyes that left them both aching for more. This morning, however, something felt different. Alyssa sensed it the moment she walked into the coffee shop, Danny's usual cheerful greeting was subdued, and several of the regular customers seemed to be paying more attention to her than usual. She dismissed it as paranoia until she overheard two women in business suits talking in hushed tones near the pastry display. Saw them at Stella's last week. Very cozy for a business meeting. Are you sure it was them? Positive. She's his assistant, right? The one with the... Ladies, Danny interrupted loudly, appearing beside them with a cloth and spray bottle. I need to clean this area. Could you move to a different table? The women moved away, but not before shooting curious glances in Alyssa's direction. Her stomach dropped as the implications hit her. People were talking. People were noticing. When Clive arrived at 7:30, she could tell immediately that he'd noticed the shift in atmosphere too. His jaw was tighter than usual, and his eyes swept the coffee shop with the kind of systematic assessment that suggested he was cataloguing potential threats. Good morning, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Morning. She kept her response equally professional, hyper-aware of the listening ears around them, but as he ordered his coffee, she caught him checking his phone with an expression that made her pulse quicken with anxiety. When he approached her table, his smile was strained. Beautiful morning, he said, the code phrase they'd developed for "we need to talk privately." Very beautiful, she agreed, gathering her things. They walked to Technova in silence, the comfortable intimacy of their recent mornings replaced by a tension that felt like walking through a minefield. It wasn't until they were safely in the elevator, alone, that Clive spoke. We have a problem, he said quietly. The women at the coffee shop? Among other things. He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its usual perfect styling. I got a call from Peterson last night. Apparently, there are rumors circulating about us. Alyssa felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Peterson was the VP of operations, and exactly the kind of man who would see workplace romance as either a weapon or a weakness to exploit. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggest our relationship is less than professional. The elevator doors opened on their floor, cutting off further conversation. But as they stepped out, Clive added quietly, "My office, 10 minutes." The longest 10 minutes of Alyssa's professional life were spent trying to maintain normal productivity while her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. She answered emails with mechanical efficiency, returned phone calls with forced cheerfulness, and tried to ignore the way Jasmine kept shooting concerned glances in her direction. When she finally knocked on Clive's office door, he was standing by the windows overlooking the city, his posture rigid with tension. "Close the door," he said without turning around. She did, then moved to the sitting area where they'd had so many productive meetings over the past 18 months, where everything had changed 3 weeks ago. "How bad is it?" she asked directly. Clive turned to face her, and she could see the strain in his expression. "Peterson is asking questions, making suggestions that my judgment might be compromised. Because of me, because of us." He moved to sit across from her, his usual commanding presence subdued by worry. "Alyssa, I need you to understand something. I don't care what people say about me. I've dealt with corporate politics my entire career, but I won't let this damage your reputation or your career." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we need to step back, take some time to let things cool down." The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. "Step back how?" "Professional distance. No more dinners. No more—" He gestured vaguely between them, encompassing all the stolen moments and careful touches that had become the highlights of her days. "We go back to being boss and employee. Just like that? If that's what it takes to protect you, yes." Alyssa stared at him, seeing the resolution in his face even as she noticed the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was costing him too, but he was willing to sacrifice what they'd built to protect her from corporate fallout. "And what if I don't want to be protected?" she asked quietly. "Alyssa, what if I think what we have is worth fighting for?" Something flickered in his eyes, hope, maybe, or relief, but it was quickly replaced by concern. "You don't understand what you're saying. Peterson has influence. If he decides to make trouble for you, then we deal with it." She leaned forward, meeting his gaze steadily. "Together. This isn't a game. Your career is mine to risk." Her voice was firm, carrying the same strength that had made her challenge him in that conference room weeks ago. "Clive, I didn't fight my way into this position to back down the moment things get complicated. But if people think you're only here because, then they're wrong, and eventually they'll figure that out." She reached across the space between them, covering his clenched fist with her hand. "I know who I am. I know what I've accomplished. And I know that what's happening between us is separate from my professional competence." His hand turned under hers, palm up, fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." For a moment they sat in silence, hands clasped, facing the storm that was gathering around them. Then Clive's phone rang, shattering the quiet. "Standen," he answered, his voice automatically shifting into CEO mode. Alyssa watched his expression change as he listened to whoever was on the other end. His jaw tightened, and his free hand formed a fist on his desk. "I see. And when did this happen?" "I understand." "Yes? I'll handle it." He hung up, looking grim. "What is it?" "That was legal. Apparently someone has filed a formal complaint with HR about inappropriate workplace behavior and potential favoritism. They've scheduled a meeting for this afternoon." The room felt like it was spinning. A formal complaint meant investigations, documentation, potential disciplinary action. It meant everything she'd worked for could be scrutinized, questioned, potentially destroyed. Who filed it? The complaint is anonymous, but legal says we should both prepare for questions about our professional relationship. Alyssa felt her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Not the relationship itself, but the way it could be weaponized against her. In the corporate world, women who became involved with powerful men were always the ones who paid the highest price. "I should go," she said, starting to stand. "No." Clive's voice was firm, authoritative. "We handle this together, remember? This is different. This is exactly what we knew might happen." He stood as well, moving around his desk to face her directly. "And we're going to deal with it the way we deal with everything else. Professionally, honestly, and together. Clive, if they think I've been getting special treatment, then we show them 18 months of exemplary performance reviews, productivity metrics, and professional accomplishments that have nothing to do with our personal relationship." The confidence in his voice steadied her, but she could still feel anxiety clawing at her chest. "And if that's not enough, then we cross that bridge when we come to it." He reached out, his hand settling gently on her shoulders. "Alyssa, I won't let you face this alone. You might not have a choice. There's always a choice." His voice was soft but determined. "And I choose you. I choose us, no matter what happens this afternoon." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down and felt her blood turn to ice. "Meeting with HR at 2 p.m. Conference room A. Come prepared to discuss your professional relationship with Mr. Standen. J. Morrison, Human Resources." "I got the summons," she said quietly. Clive's phone buzzed seconds later with what was undoubtedly the same message. They looked at each other across his office. Two people who had found something beautiful in the midst of corporate complexity, now facing the possibility that the very system they worked within might tear it apart. "Any regrets now?" Clive asked, echoing her question from that first morning after. Alyssa thought about the past 3 weeks, the dinners, the conversations, the way he looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. She thought about the connection they'd built, the way they challenged each other, the way he made her feel both protected and empowered. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "Good." His smile was small but genuine. "Because whatever happens in that conference room this afternoon, I'm not backing down. Neither am I." 2 o'clock couldn't come fast enough, and yet it was approaching far too quickly. Conference room A had never felt more like a courtroom. What they didn't expect was who would be sitting in judgment. At 1:58 p.m., Alyssa stood outside Conference Room A, smoothing down her navy blazer for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Through the glass walls, she could see 3 figures already seated around the polished table. Jennifer Morrison from HR, looking stern and official with a stack of folders in front of her. Peterson, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was about to witness a reckoning. And someone she didn't recognize, a woman in an expensive suit who screamed, "External consultant." Clive appeared beside her, looking every inch the powerful CEO in his charcoal suit and steel grey tie. But Alyssa could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched just slightly tighter than usual. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "As I'll ever be." They entered the room together, and the subtle power dynamics immediately became clear. Peterson's eyebrows raised slightly at their synchronized entrance, while the HR director made a note on her legal pad that probably wasn't about scheduling. "Please, have a seat," Jennifer Morrison said, gesturing to the chairs across from the panel. "Thank you both for making time for this meeting," as if they'd had a choice. Alyssa settled into her chair, hyper-aware of every movement being scrutinized. Beside her, Clive projected calm authority, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "Before we begin," Jennifer continued, "I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Walsh from Hartwell & Associates. She's an external consultant specializing in workplace ethics and will be facilitating today's discussion." Dr. Walsh smiled with the kind of professional warmth that felt calculated rather than genuine. "Thank you, Jennifer. As she mentioned, I'm here to ensure this conversation remains objective and productive." Peterson leaned forward, clearly eager to begin. "I think we should start by addressing the elephant in the room. There have been concerns raised about the nature of the relationship between Mr. Standen and Ms. Sutherland." "What kind of concerns?" Clive's voice was measured, giving nothing away. "The kind that suggest personal feelings might be influencing professional decisions," Peterson replied, his tone carrying just enough implication to be damaging without being explicitly accusatory. Dr. Walsh consulted her notes. "We've received reports of after-hours dinners, frequent private meetings, and what witnesses describe as intimate conversation in public settings." Alyssa felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "I've attended dinner meetings with Mr. Standen to discuss client accounts. That's part of my job responsibilities." "At restaurants like Stella's?" Peterson's smile was predatory, quite romantic for a business meeting. "The venue doesn't change the nature of the discussion," Clive interjected, his tone carrying a warning that Peterson either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "And what exactly was discussed during these business meetings?" Dr. Walsh asked, pen poised over her notepad. The question hung in the air like a trap. They could lie, maintain the fiction that their dinners had been purely professional. But Alyssa realized with sudden clarity that she was tired of pretending, tired of hiding what had become the most important thing in her life. "We discussed the Henderson account," she said calmly, "and we also talked about our personal lives, our interests, our families, our goals." She met Dr. Walsh's gaze steadily. "Because over the course of working together, we've developed a personal relationship alongside our professional one." Peterson's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "So you're admitting to an inappropriate workplace relationship?" "I'm admitting to being human," Alyssa replied, her voice carrying the same strength that had first caught Clive's attention months ago. "Mr. Standen and I have developed feelings for each other. That doesn't make our professional relationship inappropriate." Jennifer Morrison leaned forward. "Ms. Sutherland, you understand that romantic relationships between supervisors and direct reports create inherent conflicts of interest." "I understand the potential for conflicts, yes. I also understand that my performance reviews, salary increases, and job responsibilities have all been based on merit and documented achievement." Dr. Walsh flipped through her folder. "Your performance has indeed been exemplary. However, the perception of favoritism can be just as damaging as actual favoritism." "Whose perception?" Clive's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Because I'd like to know who's questioning my judgment and Ms. Sutherland's integrity." Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't about questioning anyone's integrity, isn't it?" Clive turned to face him directly. "You called this meeting based on anonymous complaints and rumors. You're sitting here insinuating that I'm incapable of separating personal feelings from professional decisions, and that Ms. Sutherland is somehow benefiting inappropriately from our relationship. That's not what I—" "That's exactly what you're saying." Clive's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "So let me be perfectly clear. My personal feelings for Ms. Sutherland developed because of her intelligence, her work ethic, and her character, the same qualities that make her exceptional at her job." Dr. Walsh made another note. "Mr. Standen, while we appreciate your confidence in Ms. Sutherland's abilities, company policy exists to prevent even the appearance of impropriety." "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Alyssa asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Jennifer Morrison cleared her throat. "Standard protocol in these situations is reassignment. Ms. Sutherland would be moved to a different department, reporting to a different supervisor." The words hit Alyssa like a physical blow. Reassignment meant starting over, proving herself to new supervisors, potentially taking a step backward in the career she'd worked so hard to build. "That's unacceptable," Clive said flatly. "Mr. Standen," Dr. Walsh's voice carried a note of warning, "you don't really have a choice in this matter. Company policy also states that personnel decisions should be based on performance and business need, not on speculation and gossip." Clive leaned back in his chair, and Alyssa recognized the expression that meant he was about to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. "Ms. Sutherland, is the most competent assistant I've ever worked with. Moving her would be detrimental to both my productivity and the company's efficiency." Peterson's face was flushed with frustration. "This is exactly the kind of compromised judgment we're concerned about." "No," Alyssa interrupted, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. "This is about control." All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was it, the moment where she either backed down or stood up for everything she believed about herself and her worth. "You want to know what's really happening here?" she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A black woman and a white man in a position of power developed a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine connection. And instead of celebrating the fact that two people found something real in a corporate environment that often dehumanizes us all, you're looking for ways to tear it down." The room fell silent. Peterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish, while Dr. Walsh's pen had stopped moving entirely. "I have never," Alyssa continued, "asked for special treatment. I have never used my relationship with Mr. Standen to gain advantage over my colleagues. I have worked twice as hard as anyone else in this building to prove that I belong here, and I won't apologize for finding someone who sees my worth." She turned to look at Clive, who was watching her with an expression of such fierce pride that it made her heart race. "And if that makes you uncomfortable," she said, addressing the room but keeping her eyes on him, "then maybe the problem isn't with our relationship. Maybe the problem is with a system that assumes a successful black woman must be sleeping her way to the top." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Walsh looked like she'd swallowed her pen. Peterson appeared to be reconsidering his entire approach, and Jennifer Morrison was frantically taking notes. Finally, Clive spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority. "Ms. Sutherland is right. This meeting is over." He stood, straightening his tie with calm precision. "Dr. Walsh, I appreciate your time, but your services won't be needed further. Peterson, if you have concerns about my judgment or my ability to run this company, I suggest you take them up with the board of directors." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "And if anyone questions Ms. Sutherland's qualifications or suggests that her position is based on anything other than merit, they'll be answering to me personally." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Alyssa alone with three people who looked like they'd just witnessed a controlled explosion. "Well," Dr. Walsh said finally, "that was illuminating." Peterson looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "I didn't mean to suggest—" "Yes, you did," Alyssa said calmly, gathering her things. "But it doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is that I know who I am and what I've earned." She stood, smoothing down her blazer one final time. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Outside the conference room, Clive was waiting for her, with an expression that made her heart skip several beats. The corridor outside Conference Room A had never witnessed anything like what was about to happen. Sometimes the most powerful statements are made in the most public places. Clive stood in the hallway, like a man who had just watched the woman he loved face down a room full of skeptics, with nothing but her truth and her unshakable sense of self-worth. His usually perfect composure was cracked around the edges, revealing something raw and fierce and utterly devoted. "That was—" He started as Alyssa approached, then stopped, seeming to search for words that could encompass what he'd just witnessed. "Probably career suicide," she suggested, though her voice carried no regret. "That was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen." His voice was rough with emotion, and the way he was looking at her made her feel like she could conquer the world. "Alyssa, what you just did in there, I told the truth." She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, close enough to feel the intensity radiating from him like heat. "I'm tired of hiding who I am and what I want." The hallway was busy with the usual afternoon traffic of meetings and phone calls, but it felt like they were standing in their own private bubble. Several colleagues passed by, shooting curious glances at their intense conversation, but Alyssa found she didn't care anymore about whispers or speculation. "What you said in there about the system, about assumptions—" Clive's voice was quiet but intense. "You were right, and I should have said it first. You defended me when it mattered. Not soon enough." His jaw tightened with something that looked like self-recrimination. "I should have ended that meeting the moment Peterson started his insinuations. We ended it together." She reached out, her fingers briefly touching his hand in a gesture that was subtle but unmistakable. "That's what matters." Before Clive could respond, the conference room door opened behind them. Peterson emerged first, looking like a man who'd just realized he'd miscalculated badly, followed by Jennifer Morrison and Dr. Walsh. All three avoided eye contact as they hurried past, but Alyssa caught the tail end of their whispered conversation. Complete overreach on our part. Never seen him like that. Recommend we close this matter immediately. As their voices faded down the corridor, Clive and Alyssa were left alone again. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything that had just happened and everything that still needed to be said. "So what now?" Alyssa asked. Before Clive could answer, Jasmine appeared around the corner, moving with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. She spotted them immediately and changed course, her expression a mixture of concern and barely contained curiosity. "Alyssa, I heard there was some kind of meeting." She stopped abruptly as she took in the scene, Alyssa and Clive standing closer than any boss and employee should, the air between them charged with something that was definitely not professional. "Oh," Jasmine said, her eyes widening as understanding dawned. "Oh my God, you two are... This is what's been happening." More colleagues were beginning to notice the unusual gathering in the hallway. Alyssa could see heads turning, conversations pausing, the familiar signs of office drama beginning to unfold in real time. "Jazz," Alyssa started, but her friend held up a hand. "No, this actually makes perfect sense. The way he looks at you, the way you light up when he's around, all those work dinners." Jasmine's voice was rising with excitement, drawing even more attention. "Girl, why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's complicated," Alyssa said, acutely aware of their growing audience. "Complicated how? You're both adults, you're both gorgeous, you're both standing in a very public hallway," Clive interrupted gently, but his tone carried enough authority to remind everyone within earshot exactly who he was. The crowd that had been subtly gathering suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, but Alyssa knew the damage was done. By tomorrow morning, everyone in the building would know that something significant had happened between the CEO and his assistant. "Mr. Standen," Jasmine said, her voice taking on a protective edge that Alyssa recognized. "I hope you know what an incredible woman you're dealing with here." "I do," he replied simply, and something in his tone made Jasmine's expression soften. "Good." She looked between them, her marketing mind clearly calculating the implications of what she'd discovered. "Well, this is going to be interesting." As Jasmine walked away, undoubtedly planning to spread the news with the efficiency of a seasoned gossip network, Alyssa felt the weight of their new reality settling around them. No more secrets, no more careful distance, no more pretending that what they felt was purely professional. "There's no going back now," she said quietly. "Good," Clive replied, his voice carrying a finality that made her pulse quicken. "I'm tired of going back." They walked toward their offices in silence, each lost in thought about what came next. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, and Alyssa found herself thinking about how different everything looked now that the truth was out. As they reached her desk, Clive paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. Around them, the usual afternoon bustle continued, but Alyssa could feel the subtle shift in attention, the way conversations quieted when they thought she wasn't listening. "Alyssa," Clive said, his voice carrying a gravity that made her look up from her computer screen. "Yes?" He glanced around the open office space, taking in the barely concealed interest of their colleagues, the whispered conversations, the way their every interaction was now being scrutinized. When he spoke again, his voice was loud enough to carry clearly across the nearby desks. "I need to tell you something, and I want everyone here to understand exactly where we stand." The office grew noticeably quieter. Phones stopped ringing, keyboards fell silent, and Alyssa could feel dozens of pairs of eyes focusing on them with laser intensity. "Mr. Standen," she said carefully, "maybe we should—" "No." His voice was firm, authoritative, carrying the same tone he used in board meetings when he was about to make a decision that would change everything. "I've spent months being careful, being professional, pretending that what I feel for you is something I can control or compartmentalize." The office was dead silent now. Even the elevator had stopped dinging. "But what happened in that conference room today made me realize something," he continued, moving closer to her desk, his eyes never leaving her face. "I don't want to control it anymore. I don't want to hide it or minimize it or pretend it's less than it is." "Clive," she whispered, acutely aware of their audience, "I'm in love with you, Alyssa Sutherland." The words rang out across the suddenly silent office space like a declaration of war. "I'm in love with your intelligence, your strength, your refusal to back down when you believe in something. I'm in love with the way you challenge me. The way you make me want to be better than I am." Alyssa felt her heart stop completely. Around them, she could hear the soft gasps and murmurs of their colleagues, but all of it faded into background noise as she looked into Clive's eyes and saw nothing but absolute truth. "And if anyone in this building has a problem with that," he continued, his voice carrying enough authority to silence the whispers, "they can take it up with me directly." The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere in the distance, a phone started ringing, but no one moved to answer it. Alyssa was vaguely aware of Jasmine's stunned expression, of Peterson standing frozen in the doorway of his office, of what felt like the entire 18th floor holding its collective breath. But all of that paled in comparison to the man standing in front of her, who had just risked everything, his reputation, his authority, his carefully maintained professional image, to tell her he loved her in front of everyone who mattered in their professional world. "Clive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this complicates things," he said, his voice softer now but still carrying clearly in the silent office. "I know this makes everything more difficult, but I'm done pretending that keeping our professional and personal lives separate is more important than being honest about what we mean to each other." Alyssa stood slowly, her legs unsteady, her heart racing so fast she was surprised it didn't echo off the walls. Around them, their colleagues watched like spectators at the most dramatic performance they'd ever witnessed. "Are you sure?" she asked, the question encompassing everything: the public declaration, the professional complications, the choice to love her openly, regardless of the consequences. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." His voice carried absolute conviction. "The question is whether you're willing to take this journey with me, knowing that everyone will be watching, everyone will have opinions, and some people will never accept what we have." Alyssa looked around the office, taking in the stunned faces of her colleagues, the mixture of shock and curiosity, and in some cases, what looked surprisingly like approval. She thought about the meeting they'd just survived, about the strength she'd found to speak her truth, about the man who had just declared his love for her in front of everyone, who could make or break their careers. Then she looked back at Clive, this powerful, complex man who had just made himself completely vulnerable for her, and realized that the answer had never really been in question. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong enough to carry across the silent office. "I'm willing, because I love you too." The kiss that followed was soft, gentle, and completely inappropriate for a corporate environment. It was also perfect, witnessed by dozens of colleagues who would talk about it for years to come, and absolutely worth every whisper and every complication it would create. When they finally broke apart, the office erupted into something that sounded suspiciously like applause, mixed with laughter and a few good-natured catcalls. Jasmine was openly crying, and even Peterson looked grudgingly impressed. "Well," Clive said quietly, his forehead resting against hers, "I suppose that settles that." "I suppose it does," Alyssa agreed, smiling up at him despite the chaos erupting around them. "Because sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to love someone openly, honestly, and without apology, regardless of who's watching." The story that began with a challenge had become a declaration that would change everything. 6 months later, she still returned to the same coffee shop every morning at 7:23. But this time, she wasn't counting the minutes until he arrived, because he was already there waiting for her with 2 cups and the kind of smile that made her believe in fairy tales. The Chicago skyline looked different in the early spring light, painted in soft pastels that promised warmer days ahead. Brew and Bean was as busy as ever, filled with the familiar morning rush of professionals and students. But for Alyssa, it would always be the place where everything began. "Good morning, beautiful," Clive said as she approached their usual table. Not the small corner table where she used to sit alone, but the larger one by the window where they could sit together without pretense or careful distance. "Good morning yourself." She accepted the kiss he offered along with her perfectly prepared latte, still marveling at how natural this had become. 6 months ago, such public affection would have been scandalous. Now it was simply Tuesday morning. "Danny's been asking about the wedding planning," Clive said, settling back into his chair with his black coffee. "I think he's more excited about it than we are." Alyssa laughed, glancing toward the counter where Danny was indeed watching them with barely contained enthusiasm. The young barista had become something of a romantic champion for their relationship, treating their morning coffee routine like a daily episode of his favorite love story. "Speaking of which," she said, pulling out her phone, "Jasmine sent 17 more venue options last night. I'm starting to think we should just elope." Don't let her hear you say that. She's already appointed herself chief coordinator. Clive's tone was amused but fond. Jasmine had embraced her role as maid of honor with the enthusiasm of a military strategist, approaching wedding planning with the same precision she brought to marketing campaigns. "And he regrets about the whole public proposal thing?" Alyssa asked, though she already knew the answer. 3 weeks ago, Clive had gotten down on one knee in the Technova lobby during the morning rush, declaring his love and his intentions in front of everyone who mattered in their professional world. The video had gone viral on the company's internal social network, and Alyssa was pretty sure Jennifer Morrison from HR had cried actual tears of joy. "Not even one," he said firmly. "Though I'm still getting congratulatory emails from board members I haven't spoken to in years." The transformation in their professional lives had been remarkable. What they'd feared would be career-ending scandal had instead become something of a corporate fairy tale. Clive's bold declaration of love had shifted the narrative completely. Instead of whispers about inappropriate relationships, there were conversations about authentic leadership and the courage to be vulnerable in professional settings. "How's the new assistant working out?" Alyssa asked, sipping her latte. "Cameron's competent," Clive replied diplomatically, "though he lacks your particular talent for reorganizing my entire filing system in a way that somehow makes perfect sense. And your tendency to tap your pen when you're thinking. He finds it annoying rather than endearing." Alyssa had been promoted 6 weeks after their public declaration, not as consolation or damage control, but because her handling of the Henderson account had impressed the board enough to offer her a position as Director of Client Relations. The promotion came with her own office, a significant salary increase, and the satisfaction of knowing she'd earned it through merit rather than association. "I have news," she said, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice any longer. Clive's attention sharpened immediately. "Good news or challenging news?" "The Morrison Group wants to expand their contract, not just quarterly consultation. They want us to handle their entire West Coast expansion. That's—" He paused, clearly calculating the implications. "That's enormous." "I know." She was practically bouncing in her seat. "It would be the biggest account I've ever managed solo. 6 figures minimum." The pride in Clive's expression was unmistakable. "You earned this, Alyssa, every bit of it." "We earned it," she corrected. "Your recommendation carried weight. My recommendation opened the door. Your work is what convinced them to walk through it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city wake up beyond the cafe windows. Chicago looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but everything else had changed so fundamentally that Alyssa sometimes felt like she was living in a different universe entirely. "Can I tell you something?" Clive said suddenly, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Always. That day in the conference room, when you stood up to Peterson and Walsh," he paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've been in business for 15 years. I've seen hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, billion-dollar negotiations, but I've never seen anything as brave as what you did that day." "I was terrified," she admitted. "That's what made it brave." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You were willing to risk everything to speak your truth. You changed how I think about courage, about leadership, about what it means to be authentic in a world that often rewards conformity. You took the bigger risk," she pointed out. "You're the one who made the public declaration, because you showed me how." His thumb traced gentle circles across her knuckles. "You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the foundation of real strength." A group of young professionals at the next table were stealing glances at them, clearly recognizing Chicago's most famous corporate power couple. But unlike the suspicious stares of 6 months ago, these looks carried curiosity and something that looked remarkably like approval. "We should probably head to work," Alyssa said reluctantly, though she made no move to gather her things. Probably. But Clive didn't move either, apparently as reluctant as she was to end this perfect morning moment. "1 more minute?" she asked. "As many as you need." They sat together in the growing morning light, 2 people who had found something extraordinary in the midst of corporate complexity. Around them, Chicago hummed with its usual energy, commuters rushing to catch trains, students hurrying to classes, life moving forward with relentless momentum. But in their small corner of brew and bean, time felt suspended. Here they were simply Alyssa and Clive, a woman and a man who had chosen love over fear, authenticity over convenience, and each other over everything else the world had to offer. "I love you," Clive said quietly, the words as natural as breathing now. "I love you too," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. As they finally gathered their things and prepared to face another day at Technova Industries, where they would be colleagues and professionals and leaders in their respective fields, Alyssa caught sight of their reflection in the cafe window. They looked like people who had found their place in the world, who had figured out how to be both successful and authentic, both powerful and vulnerable. They looked like people who had won. The morning sun climbed higher over Chicago, casting everything in golden light that promised beautiful things ahead. And as they walked toward their future together, toward Technova, toward their wedding, toward whatever challenges and triumphs awaited them, Alyssa realized that the best love stories weren't the ones that ended with happily ever after. They were the ones that began with, and they chose each other every single day. The end. Would you have made the same choice? To love openly despite the complications? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.